Real Talk USA.
Hello everyone, this is Real Talk USA. We are back again. This is your weekly show sponsored by the U.S. Embassy Addis Ababa. I'm Sisay, here with Chris and Meade. Hi guys, how are you?
Good, how are you doing?
Good. I heard that you guys have been busy.
We've been very busy, Sisay, and it's really good to see you again. I was wondering, there was a stretch during this week when I wondered if I'd ever see another human again. Like it was like from my past, and like that I, wasn't under pressure to interact with. And so it's really good to see you. Seeing you means that I've survived.
Yeah.
Come out of it alive. That's right. Come out of it alive.
I feel like I've been hit by a truck, but it was a good week. We are recording this on the Friday, November 2nd, which is the day after our second annual Countering Violent Extremism week ended. So for those of you that have been listening, you know that we've been playing throughout the last month some transmissions about countering violent extremism. And this was the second annual Countering Violent Extremism week that we've done with the African Union. We brought in this week, I think we counted them, it was about 70 practitioners from all over the world, including the United States and all across Africa, and they represented 20 different countries to come to Addis Ababa to talk about countering violent extremism. And that sounds like a fancy word. We call it CVE, our actual hashtag that we were hashtagging on Facebook. If you guys want to go back through and see it on Twitter, some of the posts that we've been putting out this past week, you can do hashtag CVE week and see some of the tweets that came out this past week. But I thought it was a really interesting week. We broke the week up into two pieces. We had the first couple of days, Monday and Tuesday, were a conference where we sort of surveyed the big picture of what's going on in the world of violent extremism. And then the second 2 days, which was Wednesday and Thursday, we had a workshop, which, it was focused on strategic communications. And as I said at the workshop, and as I'll say here, even though I'm on the radio, doesn't mean I'm an expert communicator. I always have things to learn, and I've learned a lot of tools in the State Department about how to communicate. I'm still learning how to apply them, but we provided practitioners in the room with a framework for how to better engage with their target audiences. And I even had a journalist from the United States who was one of the AU's IDOV participants say that he found it really useful. So I thought that was encouraging to have heard that. And so Seaside, the reason we're here is we're going to wrap up our CVE week, and it's not that I don't ever want to talk about CVE again. It's a critical topic, and it's part of our ongoing engagement with the African Union, but there are other things in this world besides countering violent extremism. We'll move on to the 16 days of gender activism. 16 days, we'll move on to that. After that, we got the summit, got the high-level dialogue coming up. We have the AU Summit in January and February. We have a trade conference coming. So there's a lot of exciting things that aren't necessarily CVE.
That's very
he's saying this, by the way, with a very huge smile on his face.
I can see that. I'm sorry to have been the cause of so much stress.
And so the voice you've just heard is our guest for this week. It's Angela Martin, who is the Senior CVE Advisor Senior CVE Conflict Advisor for USAID Africa Bureau. So Angela, it's a pleasure to see you again. I saw you last year at the first one, and it's been a pleasure to have you back in Addis for CVE Week 2. How are you doing?
Great. It's starting to get to winter in the United States, so everyone's a bit jealous of the perfect, beautiful weather here. It's very nice, and it's bright and sunny. We had probably one of the rainiest years in Washington, D.C., where I live.
I've heard a lot of complaints.
It was. I also lived in Seattle many years ago, so I was kind of used to it. But
you expect it in Seattle.
You expected Seattle. It really was kind of grim. And I'm a gardener, and my garden, while you think they like the rain, they need some sun. It was not a good year. So even one of my dogs didn't like it. Doesn't like the rain. So anyway, so it's great to be out here in this beautiful sunny weather, and I've always found that people are very welcoming here, and they're just very hospitable, and so it's been a great week, I have to say.
That's great. It's been really good to have you here. You're very knowledgeable. You're an expert on countering violent extremism, and so let's talk a little bit about you and your background. I learned last night after the close of our session that you were from Chicago originally.
Yes, originally. So I grew up in Chicago, and I still have family there, but I've actually lived all over the country. Like a lot of people, I went to school in one side of the country and lived in Seattle for about 8 or 9 years and worked as a postman there at one point. That was my first job.
That was a very surprising thing to learn about you yesterday. So
Yes.
for the listeners, and you guys, you weren't there either. So she worked as a postman for a year, and it was in Chicago, yes?
No, that was in Seattle.
That was in Seattle. You were a
Yeah.
postman.
Yeah.
So my dad was also a postman. So we had this great discussion last night about vicious dogs.
Exactly, it's
And about
very
the
true
worst dog.
story. Yeah, the worst dog stories. But yes, and I have 2 dogs, but that's one of the things. And then I've been living in Washington D.C. for more than 20 years when I haven't been posted overseas, working for USAID. But I also I went to school in Athens, Georgia, so I lived in the Southeast. So I've actually had a cross section. I lived in San Francisco for a couple of years when I was working. So I've had the fortune of being in many parts of the country, and which is not that unusual, but also not that typical either. Although I have to say, I probably have been in D.C. for 20 years, and it's now my adopted home, and I really like it. Although I still like the Chicago sports teams.
The Cubs, huh?
The Cubs. Once you're a Cubs fan, you never stop. That's it. That's a baseball team for those who don't know.
And a cub is a baby bear.
Yes,
right?
yes, yes on that. So.
Okay. Well, look, tell me, you've been here this week, and what are your thoughts and observations about CVE?
Right. So
There was a lot packed into that. Was not a very specific question.
So for the CVE week, and I've had the opportunity. There was a few of us, a few from Washington, but also one of the African participants who has been here for both last year and this year. And like anything, the first year there was, the outcome of the first one was to have it, to actually sort of organize it, to see who should be there. But this one really took it to the next level. And to me, and just to sort of go back, I've been working this area, as I said, I'm an expert. And part of what I say, I'm an expert because I've been doing this so long. It'll be 13 years. I started in the fall of 2005 when we didn't even call it CVE. And even then there was the principle of the response should be something that is not just security. This is a problem, the threat of violent extremism, the threat of terrorist activities, that's a security issue, but it cannot be solved with just security. And so from the very beginning, the idea that there needs to be development, what does that mean for development? That means our normal partners, civil society, the ministries of health and education, the private sector, that they all should be involved, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think over the years I've been working here and in sub-Saharan Africa predominantly, and watched how that has grown, because it really was a few experts, maybe think tanks, people in security, and now you see that there's representatives, and this is what was reflected in CVE Week. You had East and West Africa represented, and it was youth, it was media, it was civil society organizations working in some very tough environments. And I was just struck by the caliber of their experience, their knowledge. They were not being taught what is CVE, what does that mean, what does it mean to do that kind of work. They were living it and breathing it, and their passion was infectious. I mean, I think that was something that I was struck by. I think the other thing about CVE Week that was great was that, there's a lot of conferences, again, the first time you just get people together to sort of make that connections, which truly has a great value. And I think for this one it was unique because I've been to a lot of events and they usually are a little segmented. It's Horn of Africa groups. It's Lake Chad Basin groups, which the Lake Chad Basin is the countries that are around Lake Chad. So Niger, Chad, Nigeria, and Cameroon. or it might be Sahelian groups. This was the cross section, and so that has been, I think, was almost unique, right? To really bring those groups together that are actively doing this, not just sort of the introduction one. But I think one of the other things, noting, what happened this week was that it wasn't, you have a conference and it's good, you make the connections, people share what they're doing, but as Chris was saying, there was also a deliberate section 2 days of value out of technical skill transfer, really giving them some opportunity to sort of be exposed to a sort of more deliberate structure of how to do strategic communication, and then working with them to sort of conceptualize how they're going to do that. So it wasn't just like, not that I don't mind meeting people and nice talk and sharing and hearing great activities, but there was a real value add at the end. And I think one of the other things is there's going to be an effort to have these connections built.
Yeah.
And I will say, just on the side, sort of anecdotally, there were some really good one-on-one connections. And some of these, some of the people, the participants, I myself had met 5 or 6 years ago. And their first connection was with me. And to see that they've continued on it and that they're being invested in, and now they're investing back in people in their own countries to get engaged in this in a positive way is really heartening. So one of the participants actually was a beneficiary of the first program in Kenya, in Garissa, called G-Youth. And he now...
G-Youth?
G-Youth, so Garissa Youth, that was a short
Okay.
one. And that was back in, I think, 2009. He now works for one of the implementing partners in Kenya, working on a program, a cross-border program. But he talked about his experiences being part of how the original approach of working with youth, empowering them, giving them a voice, asking them to sort of be a role model for other youth in their community. And so you don't, it's rare that you see the after effects, the long-term effects of something that's been done before. And so I feel that, even the CVE week, that there is going to be some long-term effects that we'll see going out from it that we aren't evident right now, but I'm sure will happen.
Angela, thanks for that. As an organizer, I appreciate I appreciate that we've added value from last year to this year. Just a little bit of background. Some of those folks that were in the room, most of them were alumni of our International Visitors Leadership Program.
Right.
For those of you that don't know, we did a program over the summer where we took 19 young people, 19 people in positions of CVE authority, whether it be at the AU or as implementers on the ground, or like G5 Sahel, for
Right.
example. And we stuck them together, and they all went to the United States for 10 days. And they built a great network there, and came back. They all stayed in touch on WhatsApp, and that was really encouraging to see.
Right.
But the mixture you're talking about is we took them, most of them were here.
Right.
Then we added the IDOVers,
Right.
which the IDOVers is the Interfaith Dialogue, which is the AU's closest equivalent probably to
Right.
sort of an exchange program that
Right.
they have. And so the IDOVers are working on nonviolent ways to build community, and they're
Right.
all working in the CVE space as well. Brought them together, and then our implementer ISS invited another dozen or so people, and
Right.
so getting them all together, and then we broke them down. So as you know, like from these things, the relationships are often one
Right.
of the best things that come out of it. So Angela, so now that we talked about the conference and the workshop that we did, can you let's back up a little bit and talk a little bit more generally about what CVE is?
Right.
So what is CVE theory, and how does it work?
So, this section, CVE, is still fairly new, right? And it's being applied not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but you'll hear about it particularly in Europe, that they're applying it probably the most, a little bit in Southeast Asia. And really the discipline, it borrows from others. It borrows from conflict prevention, it borrows from work with youth, it might borrow a little bit from gang theory. But the idea, very simply, is that a couple of things. One, you want to try to identify vulnerable individuals or even communities that may be at risk for being supporting violent extremist groups. And you want to try to understand what are the things that makes them vulnerable, and can you try to address those grievances, those factors that make them vulnerable to it. And it could be about a sense of isolation, It could be that it's a community that perhaps feels they're disadvantaged compared to other communities in a country. It could be individuals that are vulnerable because their social network isn't there anymore. They've maybe moved to an urban area. It could be someone who's had trauma in their family, you know, and there's a lot of different reasons why that happens, right? And so one was that we've come up with a kind of a fairly formal framework to try to understand what drivers are and what's present, what are those factors, and then if there's something that can be done to prevent them. But I think more importantly is also to look more and more at what exists in the community, because many places we want to get into where it hasn't really happened. There is a consideration that there might be a terrorist or an extremist group in your neighborhood operating around, reports, and that they might be trying to infiltrate into the country. And that issue is for security service. That is not something that a development person is going to go near, or civil society really. But the idea is, what are the resiliencies in a community to prevent destabilizing elements, right? And how can we enhance them? Enhance them so they're stronger, but also that they can identify people who are at risk and are vulnerable, and then have the tools to intervene. So that's really what, you know, CV is from the development perspective. Now, realistically, part of this is that there is a component that aligns with security services or with justice, because, you know, unlike something that's like, let's say, education, right? The problem is related to a security threat. So there is ideally some attempt to build bridges between civilian security, and those bridges go both ways. You know, I myself don't really interact, fortunately, with the police in the United States very much, and I might be a little nervous or uncomfortable to talk to them because it's a problem. I don't talk to them just to say hi. I talk to them when I have a problem, right? So I don't know how to work with them when there isn't a problem very well. And vice versa. So can we build those bridges? They only come to me when they're all ready to deal with a problem. They're armed and ready. And, you know, that doesn't make me feel very calm to talk to them either. So how do we build those bridges so it's a positive relationship? Sometimes that's part of it as well. So, you know, and the other things is you have issues around conflict and mistrust of different groups, right? And so you might be doing work with trying to build those connections within a community. I think one of the challenges is when you're talking about there's a risk of extremism. Terrorism, what terrorism is that it terrorizes you, right? We just had Halloween in the United States, and you get terrified for fun, right? But why those movies terrify you is because often it's really shocking what happens, and it's awful, and you have this, you know, a physical response. And so terrorism...
So it's less and less shocking.
You know, but terrorism does that to people, right? So one of the challenges is when you're talking about working to prevent it, when you say someone might be thinking about supporting one of these groups, people don't want to go near them. It's very stigmatizing, right? So it's very challenging to try to engage on this in a way that isn't frightening, okay? And also that doesn't, you know, inadvertently drive someone towards it, because now they're seen as a problem, they're seen as someone who may be linked to them, and they're even further marginalized. So it's a little complicated, right? So part of it in many countries is to try to go in prevention and deal with the existing structures, build on them that are known and comfortable about conflict mitigation, about interfaith relations, about intergenerational relations, and building those before it becomes something that is very delicate and sensitive to operate in. I think one other thing I would add that's perhaps newer, but, you know, I think the gender balance is correct in this meeting, you know, in the sense of is the idea of the role of women, right? Yeah. And to be honest, when we started, we said, they only recruit young men, so we don't have to worry, that's fine, we'll just work our programs, we'll target them. But we did think about the role of women in prevention, right? And women as mothers, right? They're the ones who influence their children, sorry dads, but they have a little bit more time with them. They see them all the way through, especially when they're very young and their morals are being shaped a little bit. They are the ones who are a little suspicious a bit more about what are they doing and where are they and why are they out late. And so, you know, to have them have the tools to understand maybe what's happening, but also how to respond, right? And being able to steer them to maybe another youth group that's more positive, to maybe steer them to someone else who can help them, or have some conversations themselves. I'm not saying that dads are out of it, but in that instance, and there's also a lot of in conflict mitigation. There's a lot of women's associations who play an important role. So we've started thinking about that as well. I will say it's imperfect. Like a lot of things, when they say consider women or gender, it's a nice little paragraph at the end. So we're working on that a bit more, and that's, I think, one of the other new aspects that we're trying to do. I think a better job of harnessing all the tools available.
I thought during CVE week this year we had some really good women in the room. I can't say it was gender balanced, but I think there were a third of them.
Yeah.
Which is, and some of them were the strongest presenters.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was really impressed with that.
On that. Well, they're often very passionate. I'll say one of the first partners we had in Kenya, even before we were doing programming, when we went in and we're sort of trying to understand the situation in Kenya. This is back in 2008, 2009. Is a woman who in Mombasa who runs a program with sort of marginalized youth. And she was already worried about how they were being recruited and influenced. And so she was reaching out. She was proactively saying, we need to do something. I need ways to engage these young people that's not going to, frankly, have the police come in and jump on them, right? And so from the beginning, there have been some very influential women really trying to work in this area. But we need to sort of, again, be a little more systematic on harnessing that.
And there's also the aspect of victims, like the Chibok girls, for example.
Right.
And I cannot. That was the one of the big issues that touched me when the representative from Bring Back Our Girls spoke about them being now. It's been 4 years and 200 plus days since they've been abducted, and there's also that issue of being victims.
Right, that is true. They're also victims as well.
Yeah.
In some instances, they're participants. Okay, they are. Women are part of it. I mean, usually they're not picking up a gun. Unfortunately, in Nigeria in particular, they have been suicide bombers, and that has been completely awful. But they have been perhaps part of the facility. They're the ones who run a safe house. They might be the ones who can go to the market and go shopping because they're not being watched. I know in some countries where they had to create those connections between the terrorist group and the local clans, they'll even intermarry, right, and do that as a way to build those connections. So there's lots of different ways. Obviously, in Europe, you've probably read about teenage girls from the UK, or even stopping ones from in Africa going up to go get married or something, or just be part of it, right? And I think what's one of the things, though, is that while some of them are victims and they were just forced, women sometimes, we use the term agency. They are making a choice. They have been influenced, but, and so we have to also understand that we have to understand what made them make that choice, and can we figure out ways to intervene before they think that is the best option for them. And that's really important part of what we're trying to do here.
So a couple of points to go back to a couple of things that you mentioned. It's not just it came out during CVE week as well, is that there was a lot of talk about how there's a disconnect between government and civil society. Would you talk a little bit about that? Because to me, that was like the big takeaway and like our Achilles heel in this, that we're all doing all this, there's so much money going into CVE from all different directions, both at the government level and at the local, at the interface level on the ground. And there's no real coordination.
So I think there's a couple of issues, and just as background, I've done this for 13 years. I'm a little bit older. I've done a lot of different jobs, even in development. I've actually been working on development since, for almost 30 years. When I first started I was with Peace Corps, African Development Foundation. So I've worked what we would call conventional development, right? Not just a security specialist by any means. And so one of the issues in general is civil society often is seen as an advocacy group and not a group that's, engaging and providing services as well. There are some that are that do that, right? But that relationship with the government often is misconstrued as their job is to be a watchdog and to, go after the government, which there is some of valid to that, but it really should be a partnership, right? That they can help do things that the government is not best placed to. It may be resources, it might be access, and certainly in the area of CVE, that's very important because fortunately it's still not a huge problem. There's not thousands and thousands of terrorists or extremists running around, but it's also very sensitive. And, the ability to reach people who are most vulnerable, they're disengaged from society. They're not going to go to the government, and they're not going to reach out to even a government service. There's an intermediary that has to get to them, that has to reach to them. And they're the resilience in the community, right? A lot of times it should be solved at the community level. In many countries, once you have to call the lawyers or the police in, the problem has gotten too big. You should have stopped it before. It's like a couple. You go to counseling. If you have to go somewhere else, that's you're in trouble, right? And so
it's my first marriage.
Right?
Too late.
Too late. And if you had friends and family that were able to intervene before that, so there's a role for civil society, and there's been a lot of effect for people, thinking we must empower civil society to work in this, right? But then for this, the disconnect in some ways is the parts of state that have been empowered are security services. There has not been a lot of work done for a number of reasons, not for anyone, unwillingness. The Ministry of Education, what is their role? Who might be more comfortable working with civil society? Or it's, one that works with women and youth in that engagement. They're not working. There's been a few bright spots with like sports and culture where they've been brought in and there's some connection. So part of the disconnect is we're bringing the wrong parts of government and civil society together. I think they're misunderstanding sometimes what is the role of civil society, that these groups, there's a lot of variety of civil society structures in any country, and I'm not faulting advocacy groups because they might be doing advocacy to saying, we want to advocate on this marginalized group because, like the issue of Kenya, they weren't getting IDs. Mm-hmm. And so then ID cards, and so they couldn't access services. So there was a role for an advocacy group to be part of a CVE response, right? But a lot of it is more about your connections to community, right? And so there is that disconnect for a number of reasons. And I think that's where, and forms to bring them together are rare, right? And they're not replicated. Because, and I will say from my own experience, we have to work interagency. We work with USAID, works with Department of State, we work with Department of Defense on some of this. I have no idea how to work with Department of Defense in the beginning. I have never worked with the military. I did regular development. I used to do agriculture. I was Peace Corps. I didn't know how to, And so I had to learn how to engage with them and vice versa. And it still takes some work, not because I don't like them, but because how we think about addressing a problem is different. And so, and how we report to my boss is a little different. And so it always takes a little work to work together. And that's one of the other challenges between government and civil society is it's a little bit of effort and you got to keep repeating it. And often you have one effort, a training, one thing, a training, we create a structure, then we don't go to it anymore. So that effort, often isn't there. And so try and find ways to keep reinforcing it, I think, is important. And so that's what was missing, right? I think when they were talking about the participants, they aren't meeting with the right parts of their government that they do need to talk to, or it's not often enough.
What you mentioned about just getting the right people. So I'll share a story about one of the successes, actually, of the IVLP program that we did over the summer. So of the 19 folks, I'll keep it general, but we do our own reporting about successes and failures of different programs. And there was an anecdote that came out from one of the embassies, from one of the participants. And so that particular embassy had chosen someone in the security forces who had training capacity to train other police, or right. And so the story came that he had gone on this program to Washington, South Carolina, and Las Vegas, and came back completely transformed. That he realized that the heavy-handed approaches that he had been training and teaching people were counterproductive.
Right.
That people, and this is one of the things I actually heard in CVE Week from Principal Deputy Coordinator Romanowski of CT Bureau, that 71%, like there's a UN study that says 71% of people that go on to join terrorist or violent extremist organizations have been a witness or a victim of government brutality.
Yep.
It was the tipping point.
Yep.
It wasn't the first. It wasn't that happened and then they joined.
Right.
Like there was this whole series, economic unavailability.
Yeah.
All these disenfranchisement. Hostility. Just whatever the problems. But there was like this. That was like the thing. That's it.
Broke the camel's
That's
back.
a straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah.
So this guy came back and he was saying this in a public forum in the country where he was. And another IVLP in the audience. And so what he says, like, I'm going to change the way that I'm going to train our people, our police. And there was a journalist in the audience who raised his hand, and he said, he was an IVLP, 14 years, he had been a previous IVLP on a journalist program, and he raised his hand, and he said, 14 years ago, you beat me. 14 years ago, you beat me. But I'm moved, treated me roughly, but I'm moved by what you've said here. And the audience started to applaud, and they embraced, and they vowed to work together, and then they went on to agree to collaborate on another program with one of our Young African Leaders Initiative people. And so I found it to be an incredible program of getting the right person. Like the embassy there selected the right guy that was going to be, that they knew he was going to be moved by this experience. And then he came back, and now he's working with civil society. So anyway, I thought I'd share that.
And I think you bring up one of the other points, going back to like the relationship, because the security services in that study, and actually just to be that UNDP study, and it was based upon three country studies: Sudan, Kenya, and Nigeria.
All in Africa, right?
All in Africa.
That's important.
Africa, is that and that's why again the response is considered as a whole of government, because the security services have a critical role, and often they themselves have not been taught how to operate any differently. And, this is one of the challenges as well. And this is going to take time to have them say they have another option. You have another way to have your job be done without resorting to brutality. And I said, then this is a constant challenge, right? They have to be given the tools, right?
And some of those tools are community engagement, right?
Exactly.
And increasing the number of people you speak to, whether it be youth groups or imams or pastors
Because one of the things, and having other ways that you can engage, but I think because one word is the issue of trust. Because one of the foundations of effective programs are based upon trust. You build trust-based relationships between these vulnerable young people and other parts of the community. You build those relationships between young people from one group and another. Maybe the advantaged young people who are the joiners and the ones you're not worried about, and the ones who think that that's not them, it doesn't represent them. It obviously across religious lines, and again with different parts of the government and the community. So this idea of trust is central. Because again, going back to the people who are being approached, who or that are doing the approaching from these groups, that is not something that's public. That's not something that's going to be talked about. And so to be able to get back, for obvious reasons, to be able to get at understanding if it's happening and how to make sure it's being prevented in the community to go any further, is something that requires trust. And so that one of the other things I think, which is a challenge, is this takes time. You don't build trust over time, and we hear this as a donor, and we've tried to do this. Fortunately, in Africa, in many countries, we've had programs that have been going on different phases for more than 10 years. And what it's done is that there's been a presence, not a big program, but a presence to engage with community, to build up those partnerships and that trust over time. You can't just go in and saying, so, which one of your young people are being approached by Al-Shabaab? And expect anything.
That doesn't work?
That doesn't work, and expect anything to happen, anything good.
You know, when you talk about trust, it strikes me another big thing that, and you touched on this, another big thing that came out this week is the problem of, you know, there's a lot of people will join with, and then they get disillusioned.
Right.
And then they want to come home. And rebuilding that trust that they've lost, the reintegration of foreign fighters and former terrorists is extremely challenging. And that's something else that we heard this week, about this week.
Right. And that's an issue that, you know, the good news is there's people who want to leave, right? And it's unfortunately in sub-Saharan Africa there has been a fair amount of experience of when conflicts have been good news, and trying to reintegrate those people into their community, right? And so there is that experience. But again, this is an extra level of sensitivity for a couple of reasons. You know, this is not a war that stops, right? They're in a group that's been doing something, they want to come back. Well, that's very different than everyone sort of can say, the war is over in Sierra Leone, we know they're coming home, okay? So that makes it quite complicated. Because are they safe? Are they safe? Is the government going to be suspected of them? Is the terrorist group going to come in after community? So that's one issue.
Even the community, like
so they're afraid. They're afraid that they might be targeted one way or the other. So that makes it complicated. I think the second thing about it is the differentiation of why they joined. I mean, not why they joined, but what they actually did there and where they are in that process. Are they still complete, I will use the term, converts? You know, they bought into this group. Or are they someone who, you know, they were the person doing the cooking, they were kind of on the side, they were brutalized by them as well, right? They want to leave, they were just stuck. They made a choice, but it was two bad choices how to get out. And so that's very, very complicated. I think the other thing is that, unlike the end of a war, where everyone decided the war's over, except for the leaders, you're forgiven, you go home. You know, they're going to have to go. There's laws in most countries, including our own. They have to go. They're going to go to prison, maybe. You know, or something. There's going to be some. I will use the term punishment, but there's some accountability. So that makes a whole other dimension of it. So right now it's very challenging because you're starting to have people wanting to leave, right? In different environments in different ways, and but they and the challenge is there's no structures, right? And so it's really, I think we're really grappling with this on that. And again, obviously the community is going to have a role for this, the government, but this is one where you clearly need to have the government to have a role on it. This is the courts. We haven't talked much about justice. Right. And I think, you know, one of the things people say, well, what's, you know, we talk about there's not one common, you know, point, and we talked about the tipping point, right? But that tipping point really represents a sense of injustice. If there's one thing throughout the world, you know, Americans sometimes talk about personal liberties and freedoms, and that's how we look at things, right? But we want fairness and justice. Even when we talk about that, you know, marginalized groups and people who feel like they've been disadvantaged, it's because it's unfair. It's unjust. And so that is the center of a lot of the other thing besides trust is a sense of fairness and justice. And so things that are creating a sense of imbalance and injustice is where the problems are, and trying to correct that is where it is. And this is, again, where traditional justice in a community, empowering that is something that can be important. And so that
can be tricky too.
That can be tricky.
From the U.S. government.
Well, I mean, you know, on that, I mean, in different places, it just depends, right? But the point being is if it's understood, if it's fair. I mean, I think one of the things we've seen in countries like in a Mali or even in a Somalia, you know, in Iraq, these horrible terrorist groups come in and take control. And why do people stay? And they're like, well, this isn't so bad. Yeah. Part of it is, you know, they said it's because they gave them stability. Yeah. Security, right? Security, but it's a sense of order, including justice. Yes. Now, it's awful, brutal. We would not understand it. But it's predictable, right? And so I'm not saying we need to do that here, but that lack of a sense of justice is really critical to try to improve. And that comes into how we're going to deal with reintegration. That how is it fair, right? Whatever is done to these people, these young people, is it fair? And I have to point out, If they're children, if they're under 16, just like any other convention for ex-combatants, there's a whole different way that they should be treated. And they're really trying to make sure that that's what's happening. In Somalia in particular, they've advanced that young people are dealt with separately, full stop.
The reason I interjected on how tricky it can be is like I was thinking about Afghanistan,
right,
which is one of my other assignments. I'm by no means an Afghanistan expert, but I do remember, back in the 2009-2010 period when there was all this, the whole U.S. government was trying to figure out how to make it work, and one of the issues that was sort of had been neglected was this issue of justice.
Right.
That Afghanistan is so remote, and the mountains are so they just create these little micro communities. And the Taliban came in and they provided security, and they provided a way to mitigate disputes. This person's grazing on my land, and that causes me, and then they created this system whereby they could go to the local guy and he would make a decision. Right. Where Kabul was so far away, and they never these judges sitting on a bench and all this stuff that and it's you don't need that necessarily, right?
Exactly.
The problem that gets tricky because U.S. values are such, you don't want a local guy to make a decision on trading a goat for a girl, right?
Exactly.
And that which happens, right? And so it's very complicated.
Challenging.
Right?
But I also think I think you bring up a point about differentiating again programs that are in areas that have been in what I would call a hot conflict, that there's been active terrorist activity, maybe what we would call an insurgency, which is very different than many environments that are prevention. So there's not terrorist attacks going on. They might be in a neighboring country. There might be some recruitment. There might be some concerns that the vulnerabilities are there. And that's a very different environment, right? But I'm bringing up this issue of justice and fairness is because that's something that is a conflict driver as well. That creates instability in countries. And so it's not that people don't expect there to be problems, okay? They don't expect governments to be perfect. They don't expect life to be perfect. But they want to think that they're not being treated worse than others. And they want to understand, at least some way, what's coming, what to do when something happens,
Prediction,
right? And that sort of thing, that makes people feel comfortable, right? And positive about the future. They can think about that it's okay for my children's future. I know what my society is going to kind of look like. I don't know, maybe, sort of one of the other things about I touch on influencers is the issue of the internet and social media.
We talked a lot about communication tools this
communications.
week.
And so I think there's a couple of things pertaining to Africa, and even other places. So there's a lot of truth about the influence from terrorist groups abroad and even from far away. And I've seen it in Africa where, Al-Shabaab is, or radicalizing figures have recorded messages and MP3s are distributed in the continent, and they live on even long after them. And there is that influence, right? And that's certainly there. But we all know that person-to-person influence is the one that really makes the difference, right? So so it's something like it might get you an idea, but you follow up one-on-one. And the idea of building the capacity for person-to-person influence, going back to women, to have a conversation. So you listen to that radicalizing video, or you saw that, and maybe you made you really angry about what's happening in Syria or whatever, to have someone to talk to in your community about it. It's you can't stop people from seeing things. We can try, but that's not going to happen. And it's not only that. There's lots of influences like that, right? But who do they have someone to talk to about it? And I think that's really important. And people who feel comfortable to have that conversation, to give them another alternative way of looking at something, and then make them think about it, right? So and in Africa, there's always reinforcing, and there's programs that use radio. But they also do them where there's call-in shows and SMS shows and listening clubs and places for young people to sit and talk about it. One of the examples of a program and I think it was in Morocco, was the young people they lived in very crowded households. Maybe they're grandparents and they've got a bunch of siblings and it's not a big house and there's no, and it's like in the city and there's no parks for them to go hang out and things like that. And there's no place for them to just sit and talk about their problems as a teenager, right? And when they heard, so creating a space for that, as simple as that, is really helpful, right? So there's a lot of very normal, normal ways of tools of doing this that are not security things, that are familiar to communities to do, that are actually available to help start to deal with this problem in a way before it's a big problem. And so I think that's one of the things that this isn't that frightening. Yes, it can be sensitive, but there's actually a lot of things that people can do to help out early on.
One thing, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but one thing that came up when you talk about justice is the prison system. We heard specifically from a couple of the Sudanese representatives during CVE Week that this was something they were very concerned about, like radicalization in their prisons. Frankly, in the United States, that's also something that goes on. I don't know if you have any expertise to share about if I'm not sure if that's your bailiwick or not.
So this has actually come up again. The issue
seems like it's an underdeveloped.
So there's a number of reasons why it's challenging, and there's a number of ways that this is manifested. Even I will say security. I've been in meetings where the issue is security service, even as much as there's a challenge as military and police get trained, but prison guards never get trained on how to not brutalize people. That's not on the list. And even within the government, they're not considered very high on the security service ladder. So even how they're managed and how they're being operated is a challenge. But I think one of the other things, there's a lot of different ways. One of the earliest programs in Morocco was looking at stigmatization of young people that have been sent to prison and what happens, and that's their vulnerability. They're not even radicalized, but they've been sent to prison, and now, my daughter can't talk to you and that kind of thing. And it turned out they didn't even have to go to prison there. They just had to be detained and never even for like a couple of weeks and sent home. That was enough, right? So they actually started working. They didn't have to bother with the challenges of working with someone who's been in prison, just the detained youth. So there's a lot of different ways. I think governments, there's been little attempts. In Kenya early on, we worked just with the imams who go into the prison. So just to have that service going in, and then one of the presenters talked about having people go in and engage with people who've been detained, who are, faith-based, leaders, right? Whether they're clerics or whether they're priests or whatever, to go in and talk to them, right? And just again to have, it's not that you don't hear these things, but that you don't hear just one thing, right? Just that part, it's very challenging, I will say, because each government has its own way of engaging, and not only in the prison system, but in the issue of religion. Right, and who gets to go talk to people? Some governments have Ministry of Religious Affairs. I worked in Mauritania's Islamic Republic. They have a very sort of structured way of engaging in that. So I think it's an opportunity that needs to be explored more, is what I would say. Both from the issue of prevention, because people who are brought in as criminals are radicalized, to ones who are brought in who may want to be demobilized and they're going through their term and they want to go back in the community, and how can they be engaged spiritually? Right? It's not an easy role for us as a U.S. government to be involved in, but it's certainly something that we can build connections with other countries that have been grappling with this and how they're approaching it. Again, whether it's interfaith groups or civil society or others that are actually doing this, doing these activities.
Well, Angela, I think we're coming towards the end of our time with you. It's been a real pleasure to have you here this week. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to chat about?
I think maybe one other thing. We've talked a little bit about youth to a certain extent, and I think a couple of things about youth is that one of the things is that about youth being empowered. We use that term, but what does that mean?
What does that mean?
And what it means is people, young people, and this is anyone about the term, and from my definition, it's just you feel you have a voice. You have a voice in decision making, or you have a voice. Your voice is even being heard. They even want, they may not listen to you make the decision despite what you said, but at least you felt like your voice was heard. having something to do, having empowerment, having some way to engage and being seen as value, right? And so, there's a lot of different ways that a community can give value for it. I know it's challenging. We have our own issues about jobs for young people, and every country has that. That's a big problem. It's going to take a long time. And that might seem an impossible thing to tackle. But the issue of giving youth a role, having them be part of every process, is very important. And that's going to pay dividends on every area, whether it's, education and staying in school, to conflict mitigation, to risky behavior and not wanting to engage in that, to the idea of making positive choices when being approached by, whether it's criminal groups, extremist groups. This is all very important. And so, that the way to give youth tools, right? It's often well-meaning adults who are trying to help steer the young people in the right way. And there's a role for that, okay? But let young people steer each other a little bit. Make them role models and give them the space to actually articulate. We often answer for them before they even have a chance to say this. We help them. We know better. And even if we're doing something, this is a youth program. Here, let me introduce the young people and tell you what they're going to do and how we've helped them do it. We adults have a hard time stepping back. So I would say that's something to also always think about, how you can give youth the lead. And I think you'll gain a lot in these activities.
All right. Well, Angela, great having you with us on Real Talk USA. We've been chatting with, not listening to, it's not been a lecture. We've been chatting with Angela Martin, who's the Senior CVE and Conflict Advisor for USAID Africa Bureau. Angela, have a great and safe trip back to the United States.
Thank you, and I look forward to my next visit back here.
Absolutely.
And this time I'm going to try to spend a little more time. Much as I love the capital city, I'm aching to get out and see a bit more of the countryside.
You should. It's amazing.
Thank you.
Me too.
I know. Nice too.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much for
very much.
listening to Real Talk USA on 105.3 Afro FM.
See you next week.
Bye for now.
Real Talk USA.